Who is the greatest? Which is the greatest Baptist church in Southend? Which one of us here and across the other locations joining together today is the greatest individual? Perhaps as the only Methodist here, I can safely rule myself out. I wonder how that question, who is the greatest, makes you feel. If you're anything like me, on first hearing, it probably makes you recoil. Our culture is a pretty self-effacing one, and to blow one's own trumpet, to put oneself forward, to think too highly of oneself, are not popular or likeable character traits. We would all, I suspect, instinctively wish to distance ourselves from that question. I'm not interested in being the greatest. Of course, it's not about who's the best. The thought never entered my head. So yes, our first instinct may well be to recoil at any suggestion that rank or status or being first is on our agenda. But Jesus knew a thing or two about human nature, and human nature doesn't change much. So if we look a little deeper, reflect a little more honestly on ourselves, both collectively and as individuals, we will find that our concerns about greatest, first, better than, are all there, simmering away behind our modest, self-effacing exteriors. All of us nursing our private insecurities in our relationships with others. It is human nature to build allegiances with some and not others. Allegiances that run far deeper than favourite football teams and bake-off contestants. Political allegiances, theological allegiances, ideological allegiances. Left wing, right wing, high church, low church, liberal, conservative. And make no mistake, we do not build such allegiances because we want to be on the wrong side, on the losing side, the failing side. We recently welcomed a new Methodist minister into the area. He spoke of his varied ministry, which has taken him to places around the globe, including to minister amongst tribal communities. He then said how pleased he was to be here in Southend, pointing out that we are not tribal. My colleague sitting nearby muttered not so quietly, "Oh yes, we are." And she is right. And she would have been right regardless of where on earth and when in history we are talking about. It is human nature to define ourselves by others, to form alliances with some and distance ourselves from others, to compare ourselves individually to that person, collectively to that group. So perhaps we should have some sympathy with the disciples in our reading from Mark's Gospel this morning. They were caught up, just as we can be caught up, in where they stood in relation to one another. And perhaps this is understandable. Jesus had not long taken Peter, James, and John up on the mountain with him, where he was transfigured before them. Perhaps those who had witnessed this glorious sight felt that they were now the inner circle, the elite amongst the disciples. And perhaps too, Jesus' talk of betrayal and death, which Mark tells us the disciples did not understand, was unsettling and disturbing enough to turn them inwards to their own fears, and so to turn on one another, seeking comfort in being better than the next man. Whatever their reasons, the disciples seem to know they are wrong, keeping silent when Jesus asks them what they have been discussing. But he knows. He understands the defences they are putting up around themselves, the walls they are busy erecting to shore up those fears and insecurities. And what is Jesus' response? It is to disrupt, to surprise, to subvert. He tells them that to be first of all is to be servant of all. He takes a child and places it amongst them. And he identifies himself with that child. Much has been written about that child, why Jesus chose to illustrate what he was saying about greatness with a child. Innocence, trust, vulnerability, low status, powerlessness. These are all important in understanding what Jesus was saying. But also important is that the child was other than them, different from them, outside their group. Disruptive, surprising, subversive. If you want to be first, if you want to be great, then this is who should matter to you. This is who you need to welcome. The other, the outsider. Welcome them, and you welcome me. So Jesus disrupts the disciples' who's the greatest contest with someone outside their group, someone so very different from them. He redirects their attention away from themselves, outwards, towards another. Mark doesn't tell us how the disciples responded, whether it shook them out of themselves. But perhaps there are some clues in the work that some of you have been doing this week. What happens to us, the Christian community today, when we redirect our attention outwards? It is very significant that as you, the Southend Area Baptist Network, take steps to work together more closely, you have chosen to mark the new relationships that are developing amongst you by working together in the community, beyond the walls of your churches, facing outwards, serving others. Now, I am not a betting woman, but if I were, I would wager that the activities you have engaged in this week amongst those outside your churches have brought you closer together, have helped break down barriers between the cliques and allegiances that all human groups have. I would wager that all thoughts about who is better than who, which congregation is stronger or weaker than another, personal tensions and rivalries have melted away this week as you have worked together to serve and bless others. And if that is indeed the case, then don't be surprised. Because when we look at the bigger picture, where the church faces outwards, Christians from different denominations, different congregations, different theologies find that greater cooperation is possible. Closer relationships will form. A common purpose is uniting. You can see it in street pastor teams, in food banks, in CAP debt advice services, in winter night shelters, and in many other places. When Christians join the mission of God in the world, we will find greater unity amongst ourselves. And that unity happens naturally, because forcing it is not the goal. Reaching others with the love of God is the goal. None of this is to say that we do not also need to be a reflective, thoughtful church, looking inwards at ourselves to ask whether what we are doing is bearing fruit. Nor does it mean that we should never look inwards as individuals, We need to nurture our own relationship with God and spend time just with God. Rather, it is to say that only to look inwards, only to concern ourselves with our own activities, with our own relationship with God, is to risk losing sight of God's mission, to risk entering into the destructive patterns of comparing our successes and failures with those of others. It is the danger that the letter of James warns us against, the pathway to envy and selfish ambition, and so to disorder and wickedness. Wanting what others have, wanting to be who others are, is not what God wants for us. There is much to celebrate in what you have done together this week and in the journey that has brought you to this week. There is much to celebrate in what many of you are already involved in here in Southend. And there is much still to do. God is still challenging all of us in our efforts to reach out beyond the church walls. Firstly, in who we are reaching out to. Here I would like to offer one of my insights from ministering in the town centre. When I began 2 years ago, I thought I had a pretty clear idea of who I was seeking to reach. Those on the margins, those who were vulnerable, powerless, and marginalised. Those that we might relate to the child Jesus welcomes. And I had a pretty clear idea in my head of who those people were, what they looked like. They were the rough sleepers, the addicts, the sex workers, others living in material poverty. I have found people from all those groups in need of great love and acceptance, and I have found many other Christians offering them God's love too. But God has opened my eyes to other marginalised, vulnerable, and powerless people. To the security guard, whose 70-plus hour working week is not unusual, but it's a job. To the shop assistant too scared to take sick leave for fear of losing hers. To the business leader with a life-threatening illness. To the teenage victim of homophobia. All of them powerless, marginalised, vulnerable in their own way. And I wonder, are we doing enough to reach out to them too? And secondly, I think God is actually challenging us to do more than reach out. What does Jesus actually do in that gospel passage? He takes a child. He places it amongst his disciples. And he takes the child in his arms. That is outreach, Jesus style. Bringing the outsider into the centre, embracing the outsider with love. We can only imagine the tenderness, the warmth, the love of that encounter between Jesus and that child. And as I read this passage in preparation for this morning, I could not help thinking of Jesus taking that child in his arms and linking it to another image of another man taking a different child in his arms, like a photograph in negative, the image of Aylan Kurdi, the little Syrian boy washed ashore on a Turkish beach, being picked up and carried away. The refugee crisis that currently grips our world asks profound questions of all of us, and particularly of Christians. The response of some in the Baptist Church and other churches has been to offer a welcome in their own homes to those seeking refuge, a response that I'm sure will humble and challenge many of us. Not everyone can help in that way, but there are other ways to help, practical ways. But the challenge remains. The challenge that asks, not only are we reaching out to others, but more, what are we doing when we reach out? Are we engaged in the kind of outreach that still keeps others at arm's length? Or are we embracing and welcoming people? Are we willing to bring them into the centre of the kingdom community God calls on us to help build? To bring them into our lives, our communities, and yes, even our homes. If we as Christians from different congregations, different denominations, with different theologies, can find a common purpose in that, in truly embracing others, then perhaps we will find ourselves embracing one another more closely too. Amen.